I started building red clay as a studio space in the north of Ghana. It was supposed to be an experiment, the idea of building like a studio which could allow for me to make work, but at the same time could allow for me to make work that opens up the process to the audience around it. It's not really meant to be just a place where you go to see art, but it's a place which allows us to always reassess what art in itself is as a question, as a cultural medium, as a scientific medium, as an ideological medium. The ideological is very important. The railway in the Gold Coast was built by labor from other places, and the places where the labor came from, they never even got to like see these objects and these technological forms, the trains even in themselves. The people from the north never. It's the same during the time of slavery, when slave raiders would go to villages in Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger. They would capture people and then they would march them all the way down to the Gold Coast, and then through the castles, door of no return, they'll be taken to the Americas. But today, when most of these people come back to trace their ancestors, sometimes it's very easy for you to think that, in Ghana, in the coast, that's where the slaves were taken from, so I'm tracing my ancestors. But your ancestors come from very far away in places, sometimes in very remote villages and things like that. I'm always interested in how we can trace these forms back. That's why I was also talking about the idea that even in the rails and all that, I'm interested in how it's traced back to England, even to the idea of the labor unions and things like that. I made the first proposal to work at the railway in 2013. It wasn't up until 2016 that I made the first proposal to acquire the trains. A lot of these trains were old, and a lot of them had been left in areas by the sea where a lot of them were rusting away and all that, so the government didn't really deem them usable anymore. But I thought that they were interesting because of the amount of history that was associated with these objects, because a lot of these objects had either been used in the Gold Coast, had been brought by the British, or around the period of independence or post-independence era. So I was looking into all these different histories, looking at the markings on the rail lines, the markings on the trains. And I was interested in the body of the train, but at the same time, I was also interested in the materiality of the train itself. So sometimes I'm interested in the body, like the rustiness of it, and leaving it just as it is. But the interior of the train, when you walked inside, because a few of the coaches I had acquired, they had been left in some forest areas, like in Huni Valley, one of these places where the mines are. So also due to the humidity and also like the closeness to the sea and all that, there was a lot of rust. So the leather, together with the wood and the metal underneath it, had rusted, it had so much compressed together that when you took out the leather, you realize that the wood and all the other residues, the metal parts of it, were stuck to the back of the leather. And I thought it was fantastic. It's a good means to somehow produce an image out of. I wasn't really sure what image yet, so it took a couple of months to decide that we're going to make the tattoos on it, because I wanted something that was very subtle, but yet something very strong. And that is what I look at when I'm looking at objects. I think that the scars and everything present to us these memories. When an object has no scar, then it's almost as if it has not been touched. When something has a scar and all that, it speaks to us. The tattoos are particularly interesting because they trace back to the migration patterns in the early 20th century, when people had to move, like my grandfather and others, to work in the Gold Coast from the rural areas. And there was always a sense of insecurity when people would travel. So people always marked or branded their body in case of death or loss of memory or whatever precarity there existed. The body, at least the mark, would somehow refer them back to where they came from. I was thinking about that mostly in the beginning of my practice in relation to these jute sacks. The women marking the bags, cutting the bags, resewing the bags, the element of the scar within it. I thought that was quite interesting as an aesthetics, but also reflecting on the history and the politics of the society. So I think earlier on I made some photographs looking at the marks of the marks on the hand of the women who migrate, who work as head porters in the markets in Accra, looking at it in relation to the jute sacks. But for this particular exhibition, I wanted to look at it in relation to the leather forms. So the tattoos are done in such a way that they need carbon, which is collected from old lanterns. So when the fire burns, the top collects this carbon. So they burn it, and then once it's done, they take out the carbon and they mix it with some local plants and herbs, which are supposed to be like fixatives. They make things permanent, and then they mix it together with kerosene, and then it becomes very dark. And then when they make the mark on the body with the name and everything, as the blood comes out and the place becomes sore, they paint it and then leave it for a while, and then it becomes more permanent. So there's something very brutal about it. It's like a horror process of making it. But I wanted to somehow inflict that process on the leather, like the backside of the leather. But again, also reflecting on the history of like these materials in themselves, and then complicating it later by allowing the women to place their hands on it and looking at the tattoo on the body in relation to the tattoo on the train part. Because for me, in both ways, they're both like skins in a way. One might ask, what is a living thing? Is a living thing the human being, or the living thing the internal organs of the train, which has now been removed? Is the train still alive? And so one might say no, but I say every material is alive. Everything on earth is a living thing, because everything has life and everything speaks to us, because everything has the ability to hold memory. And it's that memory that we're dealing with through the photograph. In these rail lines, there is a certain sense of presence, but at the same time, there is a huge sense of absence. A lot of the generations after, they never really got to connect with these histories and all that. So then now, I'm asking myself, how do we reconnect these histories? When we bring these objects to the north through these artistic processes, ventures and all that, you can allow for another generation to connect with it in a different way. So for instance, if the men are carrying the rail line now, they're not just carrying a raw material or a piece of steel, they are carrying the density of history in itself. Reenacting is very important for me, and I wanted to create a dialogue between the rail line in relation to the body in the 24 tons of silence with the train in the background. In 2016, I was working on the shoe boxes at the time, doing some research around it. And at some point, I decided to expand the work. So I went to Tamale. There was an old factory, the Gehok paint factory. There were a lot of old documents in the factory, which were going to be burnt or thrown away. And then we collected all those materials. And on top of that, also, there was a lot of wood in it, which this wood would have gone to waste. So we used that wood to produce new boxes. But later, when I started studying these archives, I realized that they were mostly transactional letters that showed like the daily function of the factory and all that. These factories, of course, they were the legacies of Kwame Nkrumah, and the idea was to create stable economic independent infrastructure, which never really came to the light of day. So I was really thinking about this and the idea of the mark making, using a worker using a pencil to write how many gallons of paint had been sold and how much money had been made, cumulatively how the factory was being run. And I thought that the mark making was an act of drawing, and that would be a work in itself. And then with this, I thought that, okay, why not go a step further by making the drawings on the iPad, focusing on the lines, because I mostly like to use strokes and very simple lines to make drawings, and then using those, printing those, cutting them out, and then pasting them on these surfaces and papers. And I hired a group of studio assistants who would also help me in order to be able to expand the drawings on a very large scale. So again, coming back to charcoal and like very simple material of like wood, which has been burned at a low temperature, and then using that in order to be able to make these marks. Even when we're drawing, there's not too much detail that is put into it, because I'm very much interested in like just the fluidity of the material in itself. So sometimes when you're making a stroke, part of the charcoal breaks and then the line becomes thick and becomes thin again. And sometimes I'm like, let's just leave it that way. Let's not repeat over it, because it somehow shows you the inconsistency of the material itself, which is the same way when you're drawing or writing, because your handwriting changes from time to time when you're making a mark. The sculptures are influenced by the Parliament of Ghosts, the architectural form, and also like the original conception of the idea in itself. The photos are mostly of the railway, the workers' union, pre and post-independence. And the union of the railway was very instrumental towards independence. There were a lot of very educated elite people within the railway. When we took out the inside of the train for the leather, the wood underneath it was the inspiration, the starting point, to use as a means to make the drawings on top of, and then to be able to use it for the sculpture. I wanted it to be a sculpture that somehow combined the rail lines together with like the workers to the Gold Coast. So it's like a combination of very different timelines. And also I like the idea that the rail line in which the work is sitting on in the warehouse actually is coming from England. And the drawing, together with all the materials, other materials, is coming from both the Gold Coast and Ghana, modern Ghana.